Muito boa tarde a todos. Meu nome é Luciene Pereira, eu sou auditora.
Good afternoon. My name is Luciene Pereira. I'm an auditor at the Court of Accounts, and in this event, I represent the Association of External Control of TCU and the National Confederation of the Public Civil Servants, one of the entities that is supporting this event. This is yet another event of partnership of TCU and the Superior School of the Prosecutor's Office. And in this event, we have the support of the movement Elas no Orçamento, Women in Budget, which is the topic of this event. To debate the topic of gender-sensitive budgeting, we have with us Mrs. Elaine de Melo Xavier. She's Undersecretary for Cross-Cutting Matters of the Secretariat of Federal Budget, Mrs. Scherie Nicol, who is the leader for gender budgeting in the OECD, Mrs. Cristina Lacerda, she's Joint Secretary for Planning of the State of Acre, Mrs. Rita dos Santos, she's Budget Consultant at the Federal Senate in Brazil, President of the Fiscal Council of the Association of Consultants and Lawyers of the Federal Senate, and she's also one of the leaders and coordinators of the movement Women in Budget. To participate in our panel, we have Ana Carolina Querino, representative of UN Women. She's also participate along with our other panelists, Dr. Samantha Chantal, under Prosecutor General, and she was coordinator for gender matters in the Public Prosecutor's Office, Mrs. Dulce Coelho, federal auditor at the Court of Accounts. She's representing the unit that specializes in fiscal policies, Professor Aline Teodoro de Moura. She's a tax law professor at the Unigran Rio University, vice president of the Tax Law Council at the Bar Association of Rio de Janeiro, and also coordinator of the research group of CNPq, and I will moderate this event. This is an international seminar held by TCU, Elas no Orçamento, and the Superior School. It's an event that has academic support from Unigran Rio, GPDI, the Group of Research on International Law of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and with the Center of Government Studies and Public Administration of the University of Brasilia. They're also sponsors. As institutional sponsors, we have the Bar Association of Rio de Janeiro, the Commission of Tax Law of the Bar Association of Duque de Caxias, and CNCP. I'd like to ask, since I have already introduced our speakers and our debaters, I would like to ask our producers to put on the video from our Director of Gender Equality from our association. She will bid you welcome, and after that, we will begin our conference. Please, Marcos, you can run the video.
Boa tarde a todos. Sou Glória Melo, auditora do Tribunal
Good
de Contas.
afternoon. I'm an auditor of the Court of Accounts, and I'm Director for Gender Equality in the Association of External Control of the Court of Accounts. I'd like to bid you all welcome, especially our excellent speakers and debaters, very special women who are working on public finances. I imagine that several people think that this is an arid topic, but I hope that after this seminar, it becomes clear how important these topics are. The success of public policies depends on comparable and trustworthy information in order to subsidize all of the phases of the construction, since the construction of the agenda until the implementation of the policies, going through budgeting, formulation, planning, decision-making, and implementation. Qualified and detailed information is crucial not only to show the scarcity of resources in priority areas, but also because some problems are related to the allocation of these resources, and this usually is not aligned with official indicators and priorities. Therefore, we need to have adequate tools to adjust planning and budget execution of actions with the gender perspective in mind. Another important point that should be noted is that gender sensitive budgeting doesn't intend to promote a separate budget for women. The initiatives aim to analyze any type of public expenditure or tax collection through the gender perspective, identifying the implications and the impacts for women and for girls when compared to men and boys. The key question to be answered, therefore, is what impacts do fiscal measures have in gender equality? Does it reduce, that is, increase, or doesn't it make a difference for gender equality? Developing specific technologies, contemplating the specificities of the Brazilian budget and response to these questions, this is the main challenge of the government, society, and control agencies. I wish you all a very rich experience discussing this topic. Have an excellent afternoon. To begin our debates, I'd like to invite Dr. Elaine Melo from the Federal Secretariat, Budget Secretariat. Elaine, I want you to talk about your perception. You just heard our director, Gloria, is an expert in the evaluation of public policies. She's now retired, but she's a reference for us in the Court of Accounts in evaluating public policies. We have a reasonable perspective, and the federal government and the subnational governments have different budgets. And once we have a new budget, we have a fourth budget, or how does this budget, gender budget, what does this mean? Could you clarify this for our audience, for our prosecutors, our fellow auditors, and to society as a whole? Does this mean that we will have a fourth budget that complements the three other budgets that we have in the Constitution, or is it something different? This is something that we will try to clarify to our audience. You have 15 minutes, Elaine. Thank you, Luciene. First of all, I'd like to greet my fellow panelists, since we're here together to speak about such an important topic for men and women. Luciene, as you asked me to have a very educational presentation about the topic. So that's precisely what I intend to do. I want to show you the history of gender-sensitive budgeting, and I'll end my presentation talking about the Brazilian experience in the federal government. I will share my screen with you now. I start by clarifying that gender-sensitive budgeting, it appeared in Australia in 1980. It's not a recent experience. It exists for a few years, a few decades, actually. There are several initiatives that have been tested in several countries around the world, different formats, different institutional contexts. In the 80s in Australia, we had a group of women, feminists, who worked in the Australian federal government, and they were known as femocrats, a mixture of feminists and bureaucrats. And they brought the idea to the cabinet of the first minister. They wanted to implement a federal program called Women's Budget. And what was this program? The idea behind it was that each department in the Australian government, when they would present any expenditure initiative, they would have to fill in a form detailing the impacts of these measures on men and women. By filling out this form, you can break down the expenditures into three categories. An expenditure that was categorized as beneficial for women and girls, an expenditure that would promote equality of opportunities in employment, and a general expenditure. These general expenditures were corresponded to most of the budget, and the part dedicated to women and girls and to equality of opportunities, this was a smaller share of the budget. And this was all organized in a declaration that was delivered by the Prime Minister to Congress when they were analyzing the Australian budget back then in the 80s. And then, what can we say about the Australian experience? This helps us to better understand what is gender-sensitive budgeting. Starting by identifying and mapping the expenditures, how these expenditures had an impact on women and girls, then this generated discussions about public policies and how these resources were being allocated to these initiatives. Just to give you a very concrete example of the discussion that happened back then, we had a survey that showed us that the Australian government was investing a lot in high-level athletes, but these athletes were almost all of them men. So we opened up a discussion about how sports policies were not favoring gender equality. You needed to expand and increase the number of women among the athletes that received scholarships and grants from the Australian government. After this first initiative in Australia, and this assessment of the budget, this was disseminated into other countries. And in the 80s still, this initiative was disseminated to the Commonwealth countries. And starting in the 90s, starting with the Beijing conference, we have a further dissemination of these initiatives to other countries and other regions in the world. I think Ana Carolina will talk about this topic in more detail. But here in Latin America, we had a regional program from UNIFEM, which is called now UN Women. And this regional program was responsible for supporting several different initiatives that were carried out in Latin American countries in the end of the 1990s and beginning of the 2000s. Another matter that we also should clarify is that there is no recipe for gender-sensitive budgeting. It's not about saying, listen, you will follow certain steps and at the end you will have a gender-sensitive budget. No, that's not the case. Actually, we will discover, as Luciene said in her introduction, we will discover different methods, practical methods that will enable us to conduct a more thorough analysis of the expenditures, how the public resources are being collected and spent, because there's a part concerning tax collection and resource collection that should also be discussed. And based on this, we will analyze not only the design of public policies, but also budget decisions. And what are the impacts for men and women? I won't go into details, but afterwards, this presentation will be saved for the meeting, and I believe it will be shared. We don't have definitions, but we have certain concepts concerning gender-sensitive budgeting. And to advance a bit more, we see that these concepts evolve once these initiatives are applied. As I said before, once these initiatives are implemented in different institutional contexts and in different scenarios and in different countries with different histories, with different social and economic backgrounds, then we adapt the solution. And we have a very rich mosaic concerning gender-sensitive budgets. But starting in the 80s until now, we had a change that I can sum up like so. We left a perspective in which we used an analytical perspective, and then we started to use a more proposal-based solution. We started to discuss the allocation of resources based on the results from these analyses. And something else that happened in this trajectory of gender-sensitive budgeting is that we left a discussion purely focused on gender, and we started to include other elements in this analysis process. We know today that inequalities have a cross-cutting nature. Gender cannot be isolated from race and ethnicity because they're interconnected in terms of inequalities. And gender-sensitive budgeting has to involve this. We have to incorporate new categories into this analysis, not only gender and sex. And I think that from now on, this is more interesting because we have different ways of beginning this discussion about how public expenditures have an impact on men and women. The most common methods used in countries are labeling public expenditures and budget classification. Some countries, such as Brazil, and I will mention this later, use labeling. So you take the expenditures, you analyze them. This is what was done in the Australian experience. And it's as if we labeled these expenditures, separating the expenditures that benefit women and that reduce gender inequalities. And we separate them from other types of expenditures. Some other countries, nevertheless, chose to use budget classification. They created a new classification in order to better identify the expenditures that benefit women in the budgets. These are the two most common methods of identifying the expenditures. Very briefly, I wanted to show you the Ecuador experience. They created a classification. In the first level, you have equality policies. In the second level, they have a gender identification. And the third and fourth levels identify the type of policy that is being implemented. And in my final minutes, I wanted to talk very briefly about the Brazilian experience in gender-sensitive budgeting. In our country, we started with an experience that didn't happen in the executive branch. The experience began with the initiative of an NGO that worked with advocacy. They monitored the federal budgets from the gender perspective. And this was an initiative with the National Congress, specifically Prodazem, which is responsible for Siga Brasil. Based on this project that was done in partnership with CEFEMIA and the National Congress, we started this movement of identifying expenditures that benefit women in the federal budget. And this started out in 2002. This experience from CEFEMIA began in 2002. It went until 2015. And the objective was basically to repeat the Australian experience. We ran a survey to identify the expenditures that benefit women based on the criteria that you see on the screen. After that, this generated a report that was made available in the Siga Brasil website. It's a website that is maintained by the National Congress to give greater transparency to the federal budget. So anybody who had access to the internet would be able to follow the budget execution and the actions that CEFEMIA had pointed out. Very briefly, this is the timeline for the project. It began in 2002 and it ended in 2015. The purpose of the organization was to provide transparency to the expenditures that were benefiting women and also raise awareness about the organization and other social movements about what was happening in National Congress with budget. And then between 2015 and 2020, we had no data about the types of expenditures that benefit women in the federal budget. But in 2020, the Women's Caucus in National Congress was able to coordinate to include this in the budget guidelines law. And this was made mandatory. They had to show the expenditures that benefited women, and they had to prepare a methodology to explain these data.
So in January 2022, the ministry has disclosed the first report in the budget, which is the report that you can see on screen, bringing 79 budget items which are analyzed based on 6 categories, and these budget analysis represents 236 billion. It doesn't show right in terms of amounts earmarked. And based on this first report, Prodazem and the Federal Senate Advisory goes back to making available the inquiries in Siga Brasil. Here you can see the screen, so you can access and see very well the federal budget in the last few years. In 2022, actually 2023, we published the second report, Women in Budget. The report brings 121 budgeting actions with an expenditure of 348 billion. It is the first time that we ever use specific expenditure and broaden expenditure. Specific meaning those who benefit just women. And the expended or broad are also other public policies, not just women-based. And then we get to what we call the budgetary cycle 2024, where we have lots of innovations, gender-related. Then for this year, we have a women agenda, which is identified in the multi-year plan, and also at the LOA, which means the annual budgeting law, And based on what was done to date, when we identified the expenditures that had been done before, we were always looking towards the past so that the very budget process was sent and shown that the idea was that the National Congress would have better subsidies for understanding and allocating public resources, and that parliament members could really drive the women agenda. In this statement that we sent to the parliament, we also had exclusive and non-exclusive expenditure. We would add 15 billion reals, all of them, 15 billion exclusive, 15 billion non-exclusive expenditures. In the return of the budgetary bill, we developed a panel of the federal budget where we have the cross-cutting measures, which include women. So we can now follow the actions which are done in the agenda for women. And we can see all the budgetary items. We can see step by step. We can see 14 billion with 422 million exclusive and 13.6 billion in non-exclusive expenditure. And finally, we did see the publication that we have that comes with some improvements in the citation for expenditure. So I believe that it'll be very interesting in terms of information that we have. And finally, with my presentation, I was able to answer and show the questions that you asked in the beginning, that we're not talking about a fourth budget. It's not that. What we want is to be able to include the gender perspective, making it cross-cutting, so that Social Security is included, first of all, and then to be able to think about investing the budget of state-owned companies as well. Thanks so much, Annie. Elaine, thanks a lot for your clarifications. The chat is very active. We have several students here with Unigran Rio. We have mass presence here. Thank you very much. It is quite a joy to have you all. Let me hand over to Scherie with the OECD so she can talk about the international overview. In other words, what is the situation of the gender budget with markers, indicators, and other whatever qualifications? And in the next round, we will see how we can operationalize all of this in Brazil. So now I would like to invite OECD. Welcome, Scherie, Nicol. I'm very glad to have you here with us. And let me ask you, what is this international overview about the countries that are part of the OECD?
Recording in progress.
In which stage are these countries found? If you can give us a glimpse and clarify the situation, this can be very rich for debate and for us to evolve. Please.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen, if that's okay with you, and that will make it easy to go through the material I've prepared. So I guess one of the first things I wanted to talk about was really the context for the OECD and its involvement in this area of gender budgeting. And one of the main reasons that the OECD has an interest in gender budgeting and gender inequality is because we recognize that gender gaps have large economic and fiscal costs. And where there are gender gaps, it means that a country is not achieving its full potential in relation to economic prosperity. Now, there is not a single OECD country where the percentage of women employed is greater than the percentage of men. So this means that a gender employment gap exists across every OECD country. But these gaps are particularly large in a small number of countries. And if we look at the countries that have gender employment gaps of over 20%, it includes indeed countries like India, Turkey, Mexico, Indonesia, and there also is Brazil. So this is a particularly challenging situation for these countries because it means these countries are very much not achieving their full economic potential. And this is really holding back the economies and the ability of everyone to have greater prosperity. And it's disappointing in the context that in many of these situations, women have actually got greater responsibility for unpaid care and work a lot of unpaid hours, but these just are not recognized because they're not formally part of the labor market. And in addition to the gender employment gap, what we see is that women are more likely to work part-time and in sectors which are much lower paid. So this has large economic and fiscal implications. But of course, trying to close those gaps has the potential to bring large economic gains. And that's illustrated really well when we look at countries where gender gaps have closed significantly in recent years. So what I'm going to show you here is a growth accounting exercise that the OECD has done. And what that means is we've looked at GDP growth over the last sort of 20 years across different countries, and we've extrapolated how much of that growth has come from closing the gender employment gap. So Spain is an example of a country where there's been a lot of effort to close gender gaps and that they've seen results. Whereas Norway is a country where the gender gap was already very small, and so they haven't had significant changes in that in recent years. And what you see when you do this growth accounting exercise is actually that in Spain, this large focus on closing gender gaps has added 1% on average to their annual GDP growth rate over the last 20 years. So it's very significant in terms of the economic benefits that have been brought. And this compares to Norway, where the closing efforts to close the gender gap have had marginal impact on GDP because essentially there hasn't been a big change in Norway. So it provides a real impetus for thinking about how can we close gender gaps in order to realize these economic gains. And just to illustrate, the sort of potential that you have going forward for closing these gaps, the OECD's done some work which shows that if all gender employment gaps were closed between now and 2060, on average, we'd see an increase in real GDP per capita of 9.2% by 2060. So there's a lot to gain from focusing on closing gender gaps. But how do you close gender gaps? Well, specifically, when you look at things like the employment gap, there's things like affordable childcare, the need to improve the design of tax and benefit systems, so there's more incentive to join the labour market, and reduced occupational and sectoral segregation so that there's better opportunities for women in particular in higher paid sectors, which would help attract more women to the workforce. But it's important to realize that in closing gender gaps, you just can't focus on one goal like the gender employment goal, because there's lots of interconnected inequalities that women face. So, for example, if there's gender inequalities in relation to health, or if there's gender-based violence, or if there's a pay gap, these all impact a woman's ability to participate in the labour market. So gender inequalities are interconnected, and it's important to understand that there needs to be a concerted effort across the range of gaps or the range of areas where women face challenges in order to obtain these economic benefits. Now, increasing recognition of the economic benefits that can be gained from closing gender gaps means that we've now got a large amount of OECD countries interested in practicing gender budgeting. They recognize that closing these gaps are really important to economic progress, and so they want to use gender budgeting as a core tool to achieve that. When I started working on gender budgeting at the OECD, there was just a third of OECD countries practicing gender budgeting, but that is now, the number of OECD countries is now doubled. And this means that it's now the norm across OECD countries. But while it's the norm, there's still a significant variation in the quality of approach. So how can gender budgeting help? What is it actually that it does in terms of closing gender gaps? Well, we're not specifically thinking about having a separate budget for women's policies. That's not really the goal. What we are hoping for is instead improved direction setting across the budget, whereby there's a prioritization of key policy measures that are going to close your main gender gaps. We're also looking for greater transparency and understanding on how the budget measures impact different groups of society so that inequalities that are baked into those budget measures can be removed. And overall, the combination of these things means that gender budgeting helps improve the effectiveness of the budget in meeting the strategic objectives relating to gender inequality. So what is gender budgeting in practice in OECD countries? Well, as I said, there's a range of quality of practice, but I would like to draw your attention to a country which tops the OECD index for gender budgeting, and that is Canada. Now, Canada has an approach that is particularly good in two ways. The first way it is particularly good is in helping remove inequalities that might be baked into budget measures. Sorry, that's this slide. And so how it does this is through undertaking gender impact assessments of all new budget proposals. And these gender impact assessments try and identify whether there's any way in which this funding is perhaps inadvertently exacerbating gender gaps. And the example I show here is funding for health research, and the gender impact assessment showed them that actually this health research tended to be focused on trials with men. And when they looked further into the needs of men and women in relation to health research, they realized that there was large gaps in understanding of how different medical conditions present themselves in men and women, as well as different races and different ages. And so their research, as it was currently practiced, was exacerbating these health gaps. So they put in place a new measure as part of this gender impact assessment, which meant that any new funding application had to show how they were going to trial the different health, the different medicines and the different techniques across a range of people in society, so that the health research would be beneficial to not just men, but also more marginalized groups. So this is one way in which Canada is good at gender budgeting. The other way that Canada is good at gender budgeting is that it uses gender budgeting to progress its 6 key goals. And so these are set out in something called a gender results framework. And every time a new budget measure comes in that can help close the gaps in relation to one of these 6 key goals, it is put on a placemat which shows the 6 goals. And the Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister, throughout the budget process, are able to see which areas they have a lot of measures coming through and which areas they have insufficient measures coming through in order to close gaps. And they use this to try and incentivize the departments to say, okay, we've not got enough measures coming through on the pay gap. Can you come forward with something? And it's highly likely to get funding this year if you can. So this sort of direction setting has really helped bring through a core set of measures in Canada that are going to be really important in terms of closing their major gender gaps. And one of those includes affordable childcare for all, whereby the Canadian government has taken forward a large budget measure that will reduce the average cost of childcare to 10 Canadian dollars per day for all across Canada. So that's an example of how an OECD country practices gender budgeting very effectively. In order to have an effective gender budgeting practice, what the OECD looks for is a practice that has strong performance across 5 key areas. First, a strong governance framework. What we're talking about here is strong leadership and legal foundations, as well as political support. We're looking for a practice that has good methods and tools that are relevant for the country's budget practices and procedures. We're looking for a strong enabling environment. What we mean by that is, adequate training and guidance for the staff that are implementing gender budgeting and sufficient data to enable analysis. And then we're looking for accountability and transparency. So is there some report that citizens and Parliament can use to look at what the government is doing in relation to gender budgeting and what gender budgeting is achieving in order to scrutinise that and judge and hold the government accountable for its work in this area? And finally, is gender budgeting having any impact, A, on reducing the inequalities that are included in budget measures, and B, in closing high-level gender gaps? So the OECD recently started working with Brazil in this area, and we're looking at what are some of how Brazil aligns with the OECD gender budgeting framework. What we saw was that there are some real key strengths. First of all, there's a lot of political support in Brazil at the moment for gender equality, as well as other areas of equality that really helps bolster efforts in relation to gender budgeting. Secondly, as Elaine was describing, we see a strong integration of gender considerations in both the planning and the budget process, with a wave of activity in 2023 and 2024 that means that there's much more transparency on how different programs and different budget measures impact gender inequality. Thirdly, there's been institutional strengthening across government to tackle inequality. What do I mean by this? Well, we've seen the establishment for the first time of a dedicated ministry for women, as well as ministries for racial equality and Indigenous peoples. And there's also been the establishment of diversity officers within individual ministries. And this really helps bring to the fore the issues relating to diversity and equality in policy development. There's also been an intensified focus in the most recent government term on citizen engagement and transparency. And this helps really support and complement the efforts in gender budgeting very well. But what are some of the challenges in Brazil, and what are some of the priorities that the OECD has identified for action? Well, just briefly, I'm going to run through some of these. While the pluriannual plan has got transversal agenda relating to women, and while the budget has got tagging of budget programs, the linkage between these two documents isn't always clear to external stakeholders. Strengthening that linkage and having a stronger dimension, a stronger performance dimension to the annual budget process will really help citizens understand how the different programs being taken forward as part of the pluriannual plan are reflected in the annual budget cycle. There's also a need to enhance the capacity, of the government in terms of being able to execute its budget. So at the moment, we see even in key areas like the Brazil's women's houses, there's often underspends, and this relates to mixed capacities across level of government, as well as a lack of flexibility to move spending from one area to another across government. Thirdly, while the pluriannual plan sets out two key goals in relation to gender equality, there's a need for a core set of overarching gender equality goals to help guide gender budgeting efforts in Brazil. And the establishment of the new Ministry for Women, I think, means that there is the right institution that now exists that could put together those policy priorities relating to gender equality. And once those priorities exist, you can then start to think about what programs are needed to close those gender gaps and how they could be reflected in the pluriannual plan and the budget. Next, the Women's Budget Report could be further developed. I think there's a key issue in the timing of the report at the moment. Across OECD countries, we see that reports tend to have more influence when they're published alongside the draft budget and when Congress can use it when they're in consideration and amending the draft budgets. And there's also a need or an opportunity to enshrine this report in law with the new budget modernization agenda that is coming forward right now. Next, there is a strong need to build a whole of government approach to gender budgeting in Brazil. What I mean by this is ensuring that the efforts at the national level are reflected at the subnational government level as well, because it's only by having efforts across all levels of government that you can really achieve impact. I think the central government has a strong role to play there in establishing coordination groups and communities of practice that can support the development of gender budgeting at the subnational level. Lastly, while Brazil is doing well at the moment in generating new budget measures that are going to help in relation to women's issues, there's a need to move the focus of gender budgeting beyond these women's issues as well. So we don't want gender budgeting just to look at aspects like gender violence. We also want to look at how is the infrastructure budget being used to close gender gaps? How is the environment budget being used to close gender gaps as well? So how is the full spectrum of spending across government being used to help close gender gaps? And through addressing these priorities, we believe that Brazil has got a strong potential to develop an effective and impactful gender budgeting practice. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigada, eu agradeço.
Thank you, Scherie, for your presentation. It was very clarifying. I took notes. I work with budget, and I kept thinking about some aspects you brought up, some possibilities and some challenges. And afterwards, when we go on to the Q&A, we can debate this. Elaine will be with us in the debate, and we can think together about how we could put some of these measures into practice and how we could work in National Congress and with civil society organizations as well. I now call to the debate for her presentation, Dr. Ana Carolina Querino. She's a representative of UN Women in Brazil. Ana Carolina, it's an honor, a pleasure to have you here with us today in such a symbolic event and to have your presence here. You're the voice of Brazilian women across the world. You have 15 minutes for your presentation, and we'd like to know more about gender budgeting from the UN perspective. I saw that UN Women has studies going back to 2006, 2008. You have long-term studies. You have a lot of material about this topic. Yes, thank you, Luciene. Good afternoon to my fellow panelists, to my colleagues who are here today sharing this information about gender budgeting. Good afternoon to everybody who is watching us today. UN Women, as Elaine mentioned, ever since UNIFEM, ever since the 90s, once we adopted the action platform of Beijing, we have been working consistently, especially in the Latin America and Caribbean countries, especially Latin America, with regards to gender budgeting. So we have been monitoring experiences in at least 12 of these countries, and some of them have evolved a lot throughout this period. It's almost 3 decades since we have been monitoring these cases, and we have seen robust developments. There's a lot of information that has already been highlighted by Elaine, and also Scherie mentioned some of the topics that I brought in my presentation, but we're talking when we're talking about gender budgeting, we're all speaking the same language, so to speak. As was mentioned, I'd like to show you some impacts. Scherie showed us a lot of these aspects, but aside from highlighting the different needs and the amount of jobs generated, and also the quality of the employment that is being generated for women, funding of policies that aim to promote gender equality and women's empowerment, there's something that I'd like to highlight, and this is one of the political priorities for us and in UN Women. This is work that we have been doing since the Regional Women's Conference that was held in Argentina. And we are focusing on the care policies. We're focusing on the effects. I'll move on to the next slides and then I'll go back just to explain what I mean. We're focusing on the effects and the root causes when we talk about gender equality. The effects is what we see happening. Employment inequality, inequality in access to services, violence against women, inequality in terms of participation in decision-making spaces. But what are the root causes? The root causes are related to the structural points, the division between public and private, and the responsibility of women for certain activities, household activities, and this has an impact on we have underrepresentation of women in jobs that are traditionally occupied by men, and this generates several effects with regards to inequality. Something else is how we think about investments in the actions that can contribute to change social norms, actions that can change the mindset that is now embedded in our society with regards to the roles performed by women and men. This is hard to measure, but this is something that we should focus on so that we can see how that when we address actions in order to change these perspectives in these root causes, then we also address and solve several of the effects of inequalities. There's no single recipe when we talk about gender budgeting. We have several different organizations in the government structure. We have planning structures in place, and each of them can benefit from the tools and methodologies and instruments that are available, and they vary a lot in time. We have evolved a lot, and we need to check the context of each country and the context of each of the municipalities, states in a given country. Strategies and results, this was already mentioned. We analyze the budget to check how the revenues are spent from the gender perspective. We analyze how this gender perspective is integrated and included and embedded in the budget tools and cycles, how this information and the monitoring data and social and public control of this data, how this is organized. And the results are what have already been mentioned in this seminar. What we want from gender budgeting is to have more efficient use of resources. We want to focus on impacts of the allocation of these resources, how they are allocated and implemented, not necessarily increasing the budget. If you focus on the different demands and needs of men and women, the different impacts from certain initiatives or public policies for men and women, and when you think about the budget from this perspective, when you use the same resources, even if you have less resources, you sometimes might have more efficient results if you use it more equitably. And by doing this, you're more transparent as well. You can increase transparency for society as a whole. And the importance of gender budgeting, it goes back 30 years ago to the Beijing platform. We like to use this as a reference. This is when this was included in the international standards. We saw that Elaine talked about the initial experiences starting out in Australia, but with the action platform from Beijing, this became stronger, and this became one of the key indicators of the 2030 agenda. And this is indicator number 5, C1 of SDG 5. It measures the proportion of countries that have systems to monitor and allocate resources for gender equality measures. It's an indicator that includes 3 criteria: gender approaches through policies to allocate resources, the use of tools and methodologies to monitor how these resources are being implemented, and making the information available as well. Using these criteria, social control, transparency, equality, and the definition of a cross-cutting agenda. Between 2018 and 2021, 105 countries went through this analysis. UN Women, UNDP, and OECD are the entities that are responsible for monitoring the countries and providing technical support to this agenda with regards to this specific indicator. 105 countries were assessed and 14 were from Latin America. Out of these countries, the report that UN Women drafted out of this experience in the 2021 cycle. The 2021 cycle was the last time Brazil participated in the report. 10 countries were approved and 20% fulfill the requirements and 80% come close to the requirements. We come close, but we do not meet all of the criteria. We come close because all of the work that was already highlighted here. We started out with CEFEMIA and we continued with the SIGA portal. And if we analyze the scenario again, the results will be different based on the experience that UN Women had in Latin America and the Caribbean. We consolidated this in a report for the implementation of gender budgeting policies, and there are some essential steps. There's no recipe, remember, but these are essential steps that go back to the experiences that were developed in these last 30 years. Out of these countries that implemented these actions, we have 5 important milestones in the budget cycle to institutionalize gender budgeting. And in each of these moments, we have a menu with different tools that can be used and different initiatives that the countries can use in order to implement and make the initiatives operational. And when I talk about institutionalization, I mean laws and legislation. It's not simply one initiative. It's how this was consolidated as legislations and what other initiatives were also concretely implemented. We have the regulatory milestones, strategic planning, the instruments of the budget cycle, transparency and accountability, and institutional mechanisms to implement gender budgeting. And focusing on the third step, the budget cycle instruments, we have in the center information and management systems for public finances. We have the ex ante and ex post assessments about gender impacts in some of the budget programs and how these programs appear in different budget formats. We have diagnostics, indicators, objectives, and going through planning, implementation, monitoring, and discussion and approval of the budget itself. Taking into consideration the study that was conducted in October of last year, what were the advances in Brazil? We had the budget guidelines law that was approved in 2022 that had a strong involvement from the Women's Caucus in Congress. But there are some matters that we can still advance more in, focusing on management and information systems for public finances. We can advance based on some initiatives. Once again, Elaine brought this and showed this to you. This is the example from Ecuador. I won't go into details because this was already explained at her presentation, but Ecuador is a very interesting experience to study because they took the gender equality policies and they used the indicators in these 4 areas: management of expenditures, categories, subcategories in the budget, So it shows the gender policy, and in each of the items of this policy, it shows how the gender approach is being used. Promotion of economic empowerment of women, equality of opportunities, and equal work conditions, caregiving systems, and how to guarantee the rights to social participation and political participation. In each of these areas, we conducted an analysis based on the gender perspective. And the analysis is done in the level of the activities. When you analyze the integration of the gender perspective in the budget cycle, I think the most common situation is the use of budget trackers and tags based on the OECD methodology. You have initiatives where gender equality is the main objective, and when gender equality is achieved, it's no longer the primary objective, but there's an indirect impact in the budget measures. And there's another area where you cannot clearly identify the impact. Based on these markers and this classification, I was talking about the effects and the root causes. This is what I meant. I was referring to this slide specifically. You have actions that are focused on women specifically, and that focus on the effects, not necessarily in the root causes. And you also have cases in which you can analyze initiatives and programs that have an impact in co-responsibility, in the caregiving tasks, and in promoting an equality culture. Just to speed up a bit in my presentation, taking a look at the effects and the impact. Think about direct impacts, indirect impacts. We already talked about the diagnostics, the research that is conducted. It has a larger cost, but the impact in the midterm and long term in promoting gender equality, the impact is quite significant because it has a direct impact on the effects, which are more visible, where gender equality is the main goal. These evaluations, there's an investment behind this. When we formulate the programs, I know that this is being taken into consideration, and I see based on what the ministers have been saying, they see the importance of having an ex-ante analysis. And this has an impact in the way that programs are designed. And also it has an impact in the budget allocation. And this has an effect. It makes the expenditures more efficient. Not the expenditures, I like to use the word investment, not expenditure, because it shows us that we can have more efficiency. This is another thing that I wanted to show you that comes from the experience that I shared before of the form. I wanted to show you the form so that we can focus on the gender perspective in these programs. So here you take age groups of women and men. You check if the main purpose is to promote gender equality or not. What is the problem that is being tackled in that specific program? You fill out the form so that you can advance and so that you can be more effective in the budget initiatives that are adopted. And lastly, This is also something that was addressed in Sherry's presentation. How do we discuss and approve our budget? How can gender budgeting become more effective once we include it in the annual budget law? And as an annex, we have the report for gender budgeting. Elaine mentioned all of these aspects. I don't know if she mentioned values. I didn't notice, but I don't know if it presents a report with the line items with each of these initiatives in order to be more transparent. And these are a few of the basic recommendations, but I'm quite sure that this is already being taken into consideration. How can we enhance criteria to define how the programs will be incorporated into the reports, the development of tools to be implemented throughout the budget cycle, especially in the formulation of programs and in the approval phase as well, and also the implementation of the program markers and the budget classifiers. Here, we have a new platform that was recently relaunched, and it brings a map of the experiences from Latin America. Here we have several tools, instruments, and it's a platform to promote an exchange of information and knowledge about gender budgeting. Basically, that was it. These were the things I wanted to share with you this afternoon, and I'll wait a while longer to hear the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Ana, it is great to be able to listen to you. And I asked if in a few years, with operational discussions, a great reference to the world in the making of operational audits, I feel our gender equity director is not here. Unfortunately, she's an expert in the area. She knows a lot. She was part of international groups when she set out the guidelines that the entities wanted to follow. So I saw myself in these rich moments of discussions. I would like to invite Rita Santos. She's a budget consultant. She has the challenge, which has been having quite an interesting piece of work in terms of the consultancy that she does, and also in the movement called Elas no Orçamento, meaning she in the budget. So I was able to get to know Rita less than a year ago, and I've asked myself, where was I along these 24 years of the fiscal responsibility law? Where was I that I never had met Rita before? I've asked myself this many times. I've gone with insomnia, I didn't know what to do, but it was a great joy. And when we met each other was an immediate connection because we think alike about the public budget. So you can be free to say whatever you want. But one topic that was said here, which is already a challenge, is that the experience of Ecuador with an 8-digit classification, how would this be in the federal government budget reality, considering the whole federation and everyone integrated in the financial system, SIAFI? We know and we can have some planning at the detail level. If this is not in the same level, information can be lost because we need to have some budget execution which can reflect the elaboration. So this is something that caught my attention very much. We know that SIAFI is a transactional system. There's a whole security system because they have to have access to the single account of the federal government. Have you thought of this? Is this being studied? Because we saw that in order to standardize the sources, there was quite a challenge. The Court of Accounts for 2 decades wanted to follow on this up until the Federal Prosecution Office and the Federal Court of Accounts decided to write a recommendation, and the Treasury set up a norm to quantify that participation. So to me, it is a challenge to have this classification of Ecuador to be able to get to our budgetary execution. So this is something I want to hear from you. The other point is that Brazil, you point out in your reports that in the last IBP assessment, Brazil has a very high transparency level, 80%. The action of inspection agencies or the tax authority is 80%, but the understanding of citizens of budgetary data is very low. We are very behind the countries that have more robust economies. Even when I look at per capita GDP, Brazil's way behind. So Brazilian citizens do not understand. The citizens of Brazil do not understand. They need to make this exercise. So I wanted to provoke you in this sense. You also have 15 minutes for your remarks. You can share all your experience and say that myself and Gloria were joyful to meet you last year in the 7th OECD meeting. Thank you for the partnership in this event. Oh, thank you, Luciani, for the introduction to my person. Good afternoon, everyone. All of you who can hear us, we know that we have some people on YouTube. I know the event is going to be recorded and made available, so I would like to take the chance here of some of the issues that you mentioned, Luciani, that we're going to be bringing Dulce and other people. So some of the things you mentioned, it is not for me, but to Elaine. But anyways, but let me tell you where we were all these years. I want to specifically convey my words to the researchers and students who are listening to us. When we talk about gender budgeting, Elaine mentioned this very well. Our experiences in the blue planet, planet Earth, the farthest experience that we have ever recorded is Australia, 1980s, meaning the other day. 19th century in Europe, civilized Europe, women could not go to universities. So here we're talking about something that is a challenge in trying to build a world which didn't exist before. But it's a challenge for the future. The challenge is for building something new in terms of humankind. There was a Swedish researcher that I like very much. He created some heuristics, like a method called Kneffen. People who are listening to us, Kysefin, Kneffen. So what he says is that there are things that are simple. So if you want to open a bottle, you take the bottle opener. Some things aren't difficult, but if you have an aneurysm, a brain tumor, then these things are highly complicated. You need to go to a surgeon. If you have a protocol, you hire someone specialized and you have it done. But there are other things that are complex. For complex things, there's not a recipe off the shelf. That is, this is what we're talking about. This is a new world. It is a kind of humankind that we want to build. Maybe humanity that we want to build. It's a whole new paradigm of relationship, of economic relationship, of social relationship, of culture relationship, of values, and so on. So when we're faced with the challenge of establishing gender budgeting, one should know that it is part of a bigger system that is called gender public finances, which is part of an even broader theme called public governance, gender public governance, which is part of a broader system called gender society. So when we talk about this challenge to the government, one should be reminded that the challenge is huge. What we have been seeing is extremely valuable, and we need to protect this bubble of innovation that has been happening ever since the 1980s. There is a political cycle that affects strongly this agenda, and how we can protect the agenda from the political cycle, or researchers, the people from law. This is extremely important. And this is why, for the people who are here listening to us, I want to speak. As Scherie and Elaine and Anna have spoken before me, which is the government does not have the knowledge, the information, the data, or the know-how, or the technology, or even methodologies to make all this happen. Even if we are if we are to talk to all governor of other administrators and everyone else, the matter to the fact is that we don't know how to make this new world happen. This is why we need very much to have the partnership and the engagement, especially with research institutes, with the university, for those who produce knowledge, to make all this checking of what Scherie brought, meaning what are the impacts and the economic costs of not having a world which will look at women, which will consider the gender perspective within public and policy making. The university research is in every concern so that we can have a line in every department: engineering, medicine, dentistry, law. Everyone should have a same line, so that when Elaine sends people from the budgeting and management secretariat to the infrastructure department, and to make this assessment and to fill out all the forms related to gender, they'll tell them, no, Elaine, there's no gender pact in here. Everything is fine. So in this moment, someone needs to have published an article. I should call Pedro Marinho to the room, because it was an example that he gave me that I use everywhere. When you're building a bicycle path to fund a project like this, you should know that if the project is just the cycle lane, by painting a red lane in the asphalt to separate the bicycle from the car, you will not see women in these, or women taking their children. Women are more averse to risk. They need an actual project for bicycle path which holds a physical barrier between them and the cars. But who will say that? Who will teach them that what is gender impact? So we need the universities to develop these research lines. So when we open the budget line items, there will be CNPq and Q and CAPES. These are two education, scholarship, research extension program entities. They will say which criteria are being taken into account, if they have or not research lines, gender lines, and so on. So when we go into that. And when we talk about the overall impact that each one should have and be reflected within the budget, this should be included in the public sector, the way in which the teams exercise programs and so on. So when we come to discuss if the public money is or not gender oriented, we should sit and think that the public budget, which is our major discussion, so the budget needs to be sensitive to gender, but also we have several other resources that are public monies, which are non-budgetary, which also need to be assessed on the viewpoint of gender sensitiveness. I'm not sure if it was Scherie or Anna who mentioned that. I think Elaine mentioned that when we talk about funding. So you have a whole policy of tax breaks, credit breaks, funding things all around. And the criteria of approving funding for interventions, these are public resources. And one should remember that when we talk about tax breaks as a benefit, this means that the government is no longer collecting money that could be used in other actions. So to what extent when we try and apply non-budgetary resources, like tax breaks and credit breaks, and to what extent the gender is being considered. And there's a whole discussion about the adaptation to the tax matrix to gender, meaning there is an abyssal inequality, both in the rules and in the procedures, in instructions, and how taxation is decided in the country. Which are the tax parameters? All of this needs to be having lines so that the government will be informed of all of that, so that the teams know what they'll need to how to implement public policies and gender sensitive governance. So I remember very well our first experience in the federal government, Luciani, was in the beginning of the year 2000s. I would like to pay tribute to Gilda Cabral, who's a great champion in our one of the biggest references in 2006. She was the one who saw the strategic character of public budgeting for an agenda which will have the means to support values in the world which are gender sensitive. So in this time, we in SIGA Brazil, supported by CEFEMIA, created the first theme budget line items. In 2012, it was discontinued because there was a political lack of instability in the country. Budget rules were changed. Classifications actually compromised everything. And in 2020, we are trying to keep up with the lost time. So we're trying to take on it. So you see, time is gone. We are maturing. And we're no longer with the theme budget from the beginning of the year 2000. So what we want now is to have a seal that will look at the multi-year plan called PPA, which brought several innovations. I have no words to mention my admiration to what was done for the 2024-2027 PPA, the multi-year plan. Then to say that we should keep the support to this strategy of establishing clear commitments of government mandate to say key indicators, meaning until 2027, we as a country, we want to develop femicide rates which are ideally 0.96. It is very clear. This is well established as results, or we will want to reduce the pay gap between men and women in 40%, which is quite daring, but we want to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. So, this PPA brings lots of clear commitments. So when we opened our budget, which is where all the truths meet, we need to be able to see what is being done in a way related to each one of these goals. So are we funding the projects? Are we then delivering these goals at this magnitude? Are we still in a moment in which the whole effort is kind of inducive, meaning we're going to ask the agencies to identify what they're doing in relation to these things, and they are publishing their figures and so on. But our major challenge is to invert the whole reality, putting a budget that can be built to finance the theory of change, which is going to be reducing rates of femicides and so on. So the theory of change needs to occur with much more clarity in relation to the large goals of strategic priorities in the country. How do you put down the feminicide rate in the whole country? Where? Geographically, where's the worst? Which are the actions? Since we cannot fund everything, which are the actions? The 20% of actions which will make 80% of the outcomes, which is the Pareto criterion. So these are research institutes, universities, PhD students, master's degree students. They all need to help us along this process. And I'm just about to finish what Luciane brought. A world such as the one we are now, a new world with so many challenges, with so many gaps in information and knowledge, needs to be established with a network establishment mechanism so as to broaden the hands of the state, meaning the fact that we are here discussing with international organizations like the OECD and UN. We will soon hear Kelly. It is fundamental. We have had the experience, quite an interesting experience, led by budget network called Orçamento Mulher, with the House of Representatives of Brazil, with the support of Setúbal Foundation, which has funded some actions in state governments to open up this great laboratory, which is to institutionalize these protocols and methodologies of raising awareness for gender in public decisions. So if we learn this lesson very well through these new arrangements, this interdisciplinary situations, we can then scale into also governance that is sensitive to the environmental issue, which will then impact strongly women, and also race-sensitive racism, against racism, digital transformation, which is setting up a new world. And all of this needs, when the challenge is too big, we need to have pilots. And the gender agenda is a pilot with a lot of privilege for us to learn how to make what needs to be done, not just for the gender agenda, but also for a process which much is better informed of decision making, to give cost effectiveness for public spending, so that we can in fact deliver consistent development to the country. And Luciane, this is, my time is up. I'll stop here and then we can go back to what you brought about transparency of Ecuador. And how do we install this in what the federal government can do? If we can replicate in states and municipalities, then it will never happen, and then we will not finish feminicide rates or break the gender gap in salary pay. So Kelly, now this is it, Luciane.
Now let's move on to Kelly. Thank you, Rita. It's the first round. We'll go back to the discussion. Some themes are important and we'll leave them for the debate. I now call Kelly Lacerda. She's Joint Secretary of the State of Acre. I met Kelly by chance. I was working on research about budget and I met you. And I heard about you through a news report. Acre was the state that approved the first law concerning gender budgeting. And since I'm an auditor, I didn't believe it at once, and I Googled her. I found some reports from the Secretary of Planning, and he gave her credentials. He said, this wouldn't be possible if we didn't have Kelly with us because she's very dedicated. I read this article and then I said, we're going to invite Kelly to our event. Kelly accepted. She had another event, but she made room for us. Thank you for being here with us today to share this experience, this successful experience with international organisms, with Senate, with the Public Prosecutor's Office, and with the academia that can use this experience and conduct more research. Like Rita said, this is one of our objectives with this event. You have 15 minutes, and after that, we'll open up for our debates. Talk about your experience. We were quite intrigued with the initiative from the state of Acre, so please talk more about it. Thank you, Luciene. Good afternoon to all of you who are watching us all over Brazil and also from all over the world. All of you who are seeing me right now and hearing me, this is very special for me. I'm representing all of the women from the state of Acre, and I'm very honored. Luciene, I can say that my secretary is biased. He's a partner of mine. But we do have a challenge ahead of us. But it is our mission, and we have to fulfill our mission. And we tried to bring this experience and share it with you today. Thank you very much for this opportunity once again. AudTCU, UN Women, the Senate, thank you for giving me this space to share this experience with all these wonderful women. The state of Acre began this process of preparing the gender budgeting law in parallel to another movement of social participation. I'll put my slides up on the screen to talk about the legislation, and I'm also going to explain what happened through this social movement that I just referred to. This image is from the day in which we launched the new legislation. This is the secretary and the secretary for the Women's Secretariat. The state of Acre began a movement last year. We started preparing a multi-year plan, our PPA. In the previous years, in the previous administrations, the PPA went through a participatory process. They had public consultations, hot sites, organizations participated. Last year. We decided to do it different. We decided to visit each of the municipalities in the state. We have isolated municipalities. It's only possible to access these municipalities through aircrafts or boats. Our teams went there. They got to know the population and their demands. They tried to understand their needs, what they wanted to see in the planning process. What did they need for their livelihoods, what was necessary for them to have a dignified life. And when we heard the community, at the same time in our government agenda, and we had the participation of the Senate, of the House of Representatives from Brazil. They were partners of ours in the creation of this new law for gender budgeting. And that's when we started the joint process. We tried to understand what was gender budgeting and how it could be inserted in a multi-year plan. That's when the law started to be created through these discussions that started to take place. In September 6th, 2023, that's when the law was enacted. And in this law, we have principles and goals that are very much connected with what Elaine said, with what Luciani said in the beginning of this seminar. And this makes us more comfortable. We can now notice that we're in the right path, but we're still learning. We have a successful experience, but we want to share the initiative, but we're quite aware that we're still learning. And as Elaine said, there's no recipe. You don't have a solution off the shelf. We have to adapt things to our context. We have to check where we can do things and how we can evolve, because each day in which we discuss gender, we're evolving. And that's how we started to build our draft bill. And then you can ask ourselves, why didn't we simply insert this in the annual budget law? Why didn't we simply insert indicators and markers for gender budgeting in the annual law? But we needed to guarantee the continuity of these actions throughout the different administrations. So this could be an initiative that could be abandoned by the next governor or administrator. But once gender budgeting became mandatory legally, any administrator that becomes governor, they have to comply with gender budgeting in the budget cycle. Our law has principles. The principles are gender equality, equality of opportunities, and non-discrimination based on gender. How would we achieve this? Through guidelines that would allow us to analyze specific needs, men and women, guarantee equality of opportunities in the state administration, affirmative actions for equality, encourage women's participation in politics and in leadership roles. And this is very important. That's why we see so many women leaders here today. Promote policies to fight against violence against women. This is very serious. This was a priority. Guarantee access to healthcare, education, employment. And we would only be able to do all of this, or at least try to do that, if we had goals and indicators to promote gender equality. These are the principles that are the pillars in our new legislation. Our objectives are aligned to the SDGs, SDG number 5 and number 10 specifically. Basically, they aim to promote gender equality and reduce social inequalities. We talked about inclusion and the gender budgeting law, these indicators, the allocation of resources, everything, all of these measures are simply to guarantee social inclusion. Only through social inclusion can we reduce inequalities, especially when we talk about gender. In order to implement and set up our gender budgeting law, first, we focused on the cross-cutting nature of these measures. We have a Secretariat for Entrepreneurship and Tourism. They conduct initiatives, capacity building actions for women so that women can have access to the labor force. In healthcare, we have specific actions for women. In education, it's the same. In housing programs, it's the same as well. In housing programs, women are given priorities. So this cross-cutting nature is the first principle that we can observe in the application of gender budgeting. Structurally speaking, how would we see this in the budget? We would have a specific annex that would detail the actions focused on gender budgeting. I needed to give you some context about social participation. So we had discussions, we had debates throughout the entire state. We had public hearings, in-person public hearings, we had public consultations, and we had several actions focusing on women. Once we had the law was already operational, and we were starting to verify which actions would be aligned with gender budgeting. That's one of the steps that we took after the law was approved. In order for these actions to actually occur, we need to have follow-up and monitoring, assessment. We need to prepare actions, action plans. We need to have goals, deadlines, capacity building, and based on what was mentioned about budget for children and teenagers, the state of Acre already had this experience. For 2 years, we implemented a specific budget for children and adolescents, and the part involving monitoring and assessment of this budget has been quite successful because we set up a committee for this. So we brought this experience for gender budgeting as well. We set up a committee to execute the policies and programs because this committee has the participation of all of the entities of the public administration. It has the participation of the three branches of government, and we have the participation of the Legislative Assembly as well, and also representatives from civil society also are there. Through these measures, we can guarantee that these public policies will not only be a piece of paper, but we will have actions that will have indicators, deadlines, and you will have to train people to execute these policies. So the committee is a previous experience that was quite successful. And we reiterated and we repeated the experience with gender budgeting. And this began with the preparation of the PPA. Starting in 2024, when we disseminated, we said that we were preparing the PPA. We didn't have a law yet. It wasn't approved. The law was approved after the PPA. After the preparation of the law, we separated the actions that were considered eligible for the gender budgeting law. And in 2024, we will assess these measures. But this participation, this started out with the budget guidelines law and also of the annual budget law for 2025. So it's the participatory experience that we had with the PPA in 2023. We were able to separate the actions in order to create the markers. And now This committee is leading and is holding regional fora and public consultations focusing on the matter of gender. These actions will be conducted focusing on gender. And once we collected all of this information, we disclosed all of this information in the government portals as well. In order to guarantee effectiveness of the law and guarantee the outcomes, we need to monitor and assess. How will we do that? First, the law is a subsidy, is an input for planning. When we prepare our budget laws, whether it be PPA or the budget guidelines law or the annual law, we have the different priorities that are indicated in the planning process. The committee helps us in the monitoring stage and in the execution of these actions that are foreseen in the budget. The committee meets every 2 months, and in this committee meeting, the Planning Secretariat provides information about the budget execution levels in those actions. This assessment doesn't have to happen at the end of the fiscal year. It happens throughout the year because through this participation, we can intervene and course correct if necessary. And we can make the necessary intervention so that gender budgeting is actually fulfilled. The effectiveness in the execution of gender budgeting will only be possible if we have a final report of the fiscal year, and in that case, we will check based on the indicators that were presented and the results from these indicators. After the budget is actually executed, we have the different axes that are monitored. The other speakers already talked about human rights, education, healthcare, security, safety, protection, interventions. In the economic axis, all of these different axes, when we conclude the fiscal year, we can assess the different indicators that were established in the beginning of the period. And this is something that we monitor in gender budgeting as well. So we are now learning. There are several lessons learned. We got to know the realities of other countries, and we will study more about this so that we can better understand.
Como é que isso será embrionária, porque nós queremos colher os frutos
because we want to reap the fruits from the budget.
Registra para nós marco, né?
And this is a milestone for us. And it's very important to have the support of the high administration in this process. When we worked with the children's budget, and we are using the same principles in gender budgeting. And with the support of the higher management, and because of the need of guaranteeing the application and the enforcement of the gender budgeting law, I'd like to say that the state of Acre was listed in the past as having one of the highest rates of feminicides, but we are now being more sensitive to these matters, and we want to change attitudes. And in 2023, we implemented the Secretariat for Women. and it develops, it manages the women's policies and all of the agencies in government and all of the other branches of government worked together. We were able to reduce the feminicide rates in about 38% in our state. So we're very proud to say that, and we're very hopeful for the future. And I'd like to bring these results and share this experience with all of you who are watching us today. And I'd like to say that to be a woman, it's to be bold. It means we have to be bold, and we need to break barriers because it's very hard and very slow to change a mindset and change things. But we have to break barriers. We need to find new spaces. And having the guarantee of resources, having resources for affirmative actions, resources focusing on gender equality and reducing inequalities, this is very important. And we need to defend this in all spaces, not only in the government area. This should become a reality in the private sphere as well. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for giving me the opportunity of sharing this space with all of you, and especially the team from SEPLAN, who is watching us in the state of Acre. I have other meetings today, but there's a team from SEPLAN following this seminar. Thank you for this opportunity.
Kelly has a fan club here on the chat, people participating massively. And this is our success. We know that this is one kind of action that depends on constant improvement. But the initiative is success is to dare, and these are the results that you have presented. This is why the state with a capital S exists. Now we will go into a new round. We're going to invite our women bench with Aline Moura, Dulce Coelho, Samantha, but I would like to show you a video so that we can understand and get a grasp of the experience which was mentioned so far. So we can go into the debate. Marcos, if you can show our next video, please. Hello, my name is Isabelle Cunha. I am a student of Professor Aline Teodoro at Unigrão Rio. I am in my last term of the law school, and I am so excited to share with you my TCC, which is my final paper. It is called Gender Budgeting. It was an invitation that Professor Aline made me to a seminar which will take place. I thought this was fantastic and very current. For my final paper, this is fantastic because I am a politics enthusiast. I work with politics, and I was part of many projects that involve women. It's not just one more TCC, but involves many of the principles and things that I defend in my life. This goes beyond the academic world. It's my mission, it's my voice, fighting for a more fair and inclusive society to women, which nowadays don't need to speak twice to be heard. To share my journey and this so loving thing is wonderful. Thank you very much for being with me in my journey. This is another result of our event. I would like to thank and especially thank Isabelle Cunha for producing this video. She's a communicator by birth, I would say. She's a law school student. Also, Benedita Nascimento, she made a comment. She's from Porto Velho, collective of women. Also, we have a comment here that is very interesting. It's a question by Rosimar Francelino. She's saying that the talks are very powerful and how the Congress women can work in their municipal budgets and how can they look for this support. Kelly Braga, she says that the theme is very interesting. How women that study law who have been interested in the topic. I want to study this. How can I look for more information and explore the topic? Well, we also have someone from the University of Brasilia. People thinking that the final paper is one topic of many. So let me call Professor Elaine. She was mentioned in the video. She inspired students so she can say things or answer, ask questions to our conference members. So once again, thank you very much for the support to Professor Lily with all the students and for the University of Unigran Rio, who gave us a lot of support. The students are all here together on the chat with their participation.
Boa tarde a todas e a todos. É uma alegria a iniciativa desse seminário internacional.
Hello, everyone. It's a joy for this. It's an honor to be here with you all, with debater. And I made a summary with the aspect that was brought by everyone here. But before, I would like to mention to say that this international seminar produced by the higher school in the public ministry have produced fruit. It's our seeds which have germinated, not just Isabelle with the TTC and everyone. It's very important for us to reinforce in all the panorama that was mentioned by Elaine with the Secretariat of Budgeting and Finance, when they bring a panorama, a picture that ever since 2022, we have the first report of women in the budget. We have 236 billion in investments. So even though without an analysis of exclusive expenditures, but we have the budget ready for 2022. And we also have the challenge of taking forth, and students don't know, the professionals don't know, the students of financial law don't know gender sensitive budget. So how can he break this barrier? How can we contribute academically? This was the speech by Rita, the challenge of building a new world based on the gender perspective that should exist in every department. This should be part of every discussion in every bench of every university. She gave a good example of bicycles and so on, that women are not going to go in this bicycle lane if there aren't physical barriers. I had never thought of that. It is so obvious. I would never, women will never, mothers will never do that. Public policies should have to do, there should be a measurement of the activity as mentioned by Kelly here, bringing the example of the first law of a subnational entity in Acre, state of Brazil. Let's mention the subnational entity, but Acre state in the first state law in gender-sensitive budget, and to bring these aspects for monitoring and assessment of projects and how to measure the effectiveness of an example, actually, that talking about the municipality, we'll have municipal election this year. How subnational entities with over 5,000 municipalities can learn and go further and take to the municipal budgets the proposals for gender budgeting. So in 2024, Elaine mentioned there was a great innovation, the PPA, the multi-year plan to show exclusive and non-exclusive gender expenditures. Also, there is a bill which will include, this will be much better than before, because in the past we did not have this gender sensitive perspective. So this is needed for us to be putting our challenges and everything that is exposed here. Also, Scherie, Nicol brought a world overview. She brought the beautiful example of Canada as a model for gender impact assessment. She mentioned Canada as at the top. She also mentioned aspects that we live in the Brazilian reality in relation to economic stalls, in a specific case, the gender pay gap. She showed a flow chart. She mentioned the position of Brazil. Brazil is among the 10 richest countries in the world. However, it is far away from breaking the gap, the pay gap, and in many other aspects. So she mentioned about the GDP growth does not translate into reduction of inequalities. She was clear on that. So Ana Carolina, ONU Mulheres, the UN Women. Students are here. They want to see the presentation. We have students from the university that I teach. They want to be part of the bills, drafting. They are doing the gender sensitive budget. So they want, where's the link? Where's this? Where's that? So students are taking pictures. They're having so much fun. They said, we have a link. Let's share the material here of the event. So this is so satisfactory. It makes us feel good and warm at heart. Ana Carolina mentioned about the advancements of Brazil in setting up programs. So given this scenario of these fantastic women, each one of them in their own work plan and their function of bringing rich information, which brings a lot in the international plan, I would like to put for debate how Brazil could advance in the improvement of the participation of social arena of women in the gender budgeting, how control entities or they could contribute really so that Brazil can get away from the position it is found today of extreme inequality. Although Brazil is evolving, as mentioned, as Scherie mentioned, is improving. It's better today than in previous years, but we still have a lot of difficulty in transparency and in participation. And where can we suggest an improvement in the figures with the participation of control entities in the legislature? So thank you very much, Aline, for your contribution, your participation in the debate. I want to ask Elaine if she wants to come in for a comment so we can go on to other debate members. We have until 5:30 here. Yeah, let's go to Elaine, Rita, so we can hear everyone's participation, okay? Yes, Luciane. I'll be brief, so we can have more time for the debate. So to answer to Aline, I think, and I always say that for us to have more social participation, in other words, for us to have an actual exercise of social control on the budget, the first step is information. This is why identification of the actions in the budget are so important, because when I talked about the experience of Cefemia, what was the experience of Cefemia? Was that in order to improve the incidence in the budget, in order to better defend the interest of women in the annual proposal in the parliament, they needed to know how women were being benefited in the budget in the previous year. So this is what we have been facing mostly, in a sense that we need to be able to project better information in relation to these expenditures. The Brazilian budget, for many reasons that I shouldn't be delving into right now, is a budget that we cannot see as clearly the connection between policy making and public spending, or the beneficiary in the end of the day. So we need to advance in gender sensitive budgets and in everything else, so we can give transparency to these expenditures. And from then, we can in fact have information that make it possible for the society to participate in the making and in the monitoring and the execution of the budget. So it is in this sense, I think it's fundamental that one thing will dialogue to the other: transparency and social participation. Yeah, all right, Elaine. Thanks a lot. Rita. Yes, I want to answer how the Congress, the councilors and congresswomen participate. To the students that are here, the 1988 Constitution is, if you will, a parliamentarist constitution. It gives full prerogatives to the legislature, including in terms of the budget making, to be making and instance decisions, including the veto power of the mayor or governor, as it was with the episode of the report of women in budgeting. So this is like a broad prerogative given to the legislature. They can request information, they can call databases, all of these prerogatives that the Constitution brought to the legislature give this power, first of all, to the primary responsible for transparency, which is not the executive branch. The executive branch is to execute, to make policies happen. The function of the legislature, which is to inspect, to regulate, and represent. With these representations and prerogatives in the Constitution, throw to the lap of the legislature the duty of creating capacities to offer transparency to the society. Siga Brazil, during the time that we had a major corruption scandal, you can be well and remember of that. SIAFI was stringed with secrecy passwords up until level 9 of the Minister of State. It was the Federal Senate that overthrew, at the blink of an eye, giving access to any citizen, the base of the SIAFI, with the last generation or cutting edge generation tool, which was the business plan. So this comes to show that if there's no transparency, we should be charging the legislature, first of all. Elaine mentioned to give information for the qualification of the social participation of women. This is also the prerogative of establishing legislature, creating priorities and parameters that public policies must observe. The legislature is not going to create a program, but it says that if the program should follow such and such criteria, this is within the legislative branch to follow. It's a big agenda that is calling upon the action of the legislature. Thank you, Rita. I hope that it's become very clear. The question of Dr. Aline. To me, I still have a few things I want to share with you. What is motivated to be sitting with Rita? And we can idealize in record time this seminar. This topic is pounding within our institutions in the civil society. I was invited on March 8th, International Women's Day, and I went to do my homework to make my speech. And I saw that the figures show a methodological challenge, like a report of women and budget in 2021 has 235 billion, 2022 300 billion, and last year I didn't even check because I didn't want to anticipate. Think the report is going to be now on March 30th, and for this year is about 14 billion. So I cannot understand that a woman a budget going from 300 billion to 15 billion. So when we know the realities and the difficulties of the federal government budgeting, ever since the beginning, when I looked, I saw there are a lot of pieces of information and expenditures, and I bet health and education is probably all in all to get to this volume. So I think we have a big challenge, and this challenge is still in the markers. I'll go back with Elaine because I participated in all the process of building standardization and transparency, something that all of us want to have. But if we don't have enough standardized information, ever since the beginning of the budget up until its execution, it is very hard for a citizen to track, pinpoint, compare, and understand what is being done in the federal government, the states, and municipalities. And these are public policies that the federal government executes in a decentralized way. So it doesn't matter too much for you to have a code and a structure of decoding of expenditures in the federal government. If you don't go down into states and municipalities with standardization, comparison, traceability, and the value transparency, it's compromised.
The challenge is how to identify these expenditures to know how much was actually executed, because simply being in the budget is no guarantee, because sometimes you have cutbacks, contingencies, and other critical factors involving public finances. So if we don't take a look at the execution per se, I idealized X and executed Y. But to talk about this challenge, I'm going to call somebody who knows a lot about finances, works with expenditure caps. We're from the same group. She works at Fiscal. It's a unit that specializes in the federal budget. And the standards, they define the standards as well. I'm a part of this technical unit as well, but I'm not speaking on behalf of the Court of Accounts. We invited a colleague that knows a lot about financial execution, expenditures, so that we can actually understand what was spent. I'm going to call my colleague, Dulcie, so that she can make comments, ask questions, because some things are not clear to me yet. And I work in this area. So how can this become a reality in the federal government? From the moment in which the budget is drafted until it is executed. Dulcie, can you help us out? Good afternoon. The first thing I'd like to say is the same thing that you said, the difference in the numbers. The numbers have to be better refined. Nevertheless, there's something even more important in the concept of gender budgeting. What it's behind this in theory is that gender budgeting, which focuses on women, it's privileging society because you monetize women's labor, you reduce inequalities, you contribute to the social conditions. And society is now so polarized, especially in Brazil. When we focus on this, this is relevant for the topic. Scherie talked about the data from Spain, and this is interesting. There was a strong policy to reduce wage inequalities, and this reflected in the GDP. So in society, we have to say that we're defending women, but at the same time, we're defending society as a whole. And this is important to highlight because sometimes people say, oh, this is what feminists want, but there's a relevant objective. It's a common good. It serves everybody. I'm improving society when I make women's lives better. And I wanted you to talk a bit about this because this is a very relevant point in our discussion today. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you. Thank you, Dulce. Excellent contribution. And I now pass the floor to Scherie. I don't know who would like to answer. Ana, Querino already talked and said something, but please feel free to make comments. Maybe Scherie can go back to that point that she raised. We had a first round from Brazil and now, and I also want to say something after her.
Thanks very much. Thanks very
I
much.
think it's very, very important. I think Kelly is speaking. Sorry, Scherie. I want to raise this matter about the quality of expenditures, the importance that the execution is very well defined because sometimes the values don't match the reality. And in this, we have to consider the expenditures in healthcare, in education, and this doesn't show us what we need to invest. So it's good that this has been identified, that this has been raised in the debate, because this is something that bothered us when we studied the data to draft the draft bill, because we saw the volume of investments that were made, but we couldn't see the execution of these actions. And that's why in our debate, in our internal debate, we tried to identify extra actions. And in this conversation with the different agencies from the public administration, we noticed that we needed to go beyond what we were doing. We needed to identify new actions that could truly give access, that could give visibility to these actions, that could contribute to reduce inequalities, and that could promote gender equality. So it's very important to talk about this. And the student that talk about her final work, her final thesis, it's great to hear that, this concern of you. You're interested in the topic. This has to become more visible. And I'm very glad to hear that you're interested in the state of Acre. This is a very heated discussion. It became a master's thesis. And we had a staff member that worked on this, on his thesis. He is concluding his course now. He will present very soon. And Dennis is a reference in the state of Acre. And if the student wants to know more about this thesis, we have more to share. Great. Excellent. We have a dissertation being, I now pass the floor to Scherie so that she can make her comments about the approach that my colleague Dulce from the Court of Accounts just talked about. Go ahead, Scherie.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I just wanted to make a brief comment really about, the Spanish example. I think it's so important that the economic benefits of gender equality are recognized, because something that we see across OECD countries is really gender equality becoming a very polarizing political issue, and where only the social benefits are, or the moral imperative behind gender equality are seen as drivers for gender budgeting, then I think there's challenges in relation to efforts on gender budgeting being sustained over different political cycles. But I think where the economic benefits are recognized and well understood, and where politicians understand that gender equality is central to everybody's economic prosperity, then we're in a position whereby we have sustainability of effort across the political cycle. And this is what we see in countries like Iceland. And I remember the first ever meeting that we had of our gender budgeting network in Iceland, and we had the Minister of Finance giving a keynote address and he was from the Conservative Party, so a party on the right of the political spectrum. And he said to the group, he said, gender equality to him was about economic prosperity and it was about freedom. And so that was something that he could get 100% behind. And this is what we want to see across OECD member countries and beyond, is gender equality being recognized as just central to freedom and prosperity across all of our nations. So that's what I wanted to come in and say there. Thank you.
Muitíssimo obrigada. Eu espero
Thank you. I hope Dulce's question was answered, and now I pass the floor to Samantha. Luciene, I'd like to clarify a point. You raised an important point about the values, the numbers and the reports and the agendas. And I think I have to clarify this matter a bit more. Just going back to the presentations that were made, in the presentations, we made clear, both from the national perspective and international perspective, that we don't have a methodology to identify the expenditures in public budgets. What we do is experiments. And that's what we have been doing in the budget reports, in the gender budgeting reports. In 2022, we had a first exercise. This exercise had some problems, as you just said. Since, as I said before, since the federal budget is a budget that has large expenditures, it covers several public policies that are funded by a same program sometimes. Not always. Even when you talk to the ministries that are responsible for these public policies, not always can you identify the participation of women in that specific expenditure. So if we have a budget action, basic healthcare, for instance, it finances primary healthcare in the country. And it's very hard for you to take a look at that billion-dollar action and identify the participation of women in that action, because it's an expenditure that happens in the subnational levels. The federal government funds the states and the municipalities in these matters. These institutional issues involving the budget makes it hard for us to identify precisely who is benefited and where everything is spent. What we have done in the reports, we have tweaked the methodology and enhanced the methodology so that we can break down the expenditures so that we can be more accurate in this identification process. You talked about the reductions in the values in the budgets. Part of this reduction is related to the breakdown of the expenses, because we use methodological strategies to fine-tune the expenditures and reach the reality that is taking place on the ground. So we establish a methodology. You have exclusive and non-exclusive expenditures. Why do we do that? Because The focus is on the non-exclusive expenditures because the exclusive expenditures are already solved. So you face the difficulties in a different way. In this third report that we will publish by the end of the month, we will use other strategies in order to perform these calculations. You talked about the justifications and the criteria for certain actions to be included in the report or not. This year, we will publish an Excel spreadsheet with all of the budget information about each of the actions, justifying each of the programs, why that program was included or not. This is transparency. Concerning non-exclusive actions, we also worked with the responsible agencies. We tried to better identify the participation of women in that specific expense. In some cases, we advanced, in others, we didn't. And in the cases in which we couldn't advance, we used another strategy that we use in early childhood budget. So we use a demographic indicator. We say that participation of women in that expenditure is very close to the participation of women in the Brazilian population. It's a proxy, but it reduces the distortions when you consider billions of reais. And just to conclude my train of thought, and I'd also like to clarify a last point that it is related with the difference in values between the report and the draft bill for the yearly budget. When we talk about the PLOA, which is the yearly draft bill for the budget, so sometimes you have lack of planning from the agencies, or you have difficulties because of the public policies and how they're implemented. The agencies, when the draft bill is going through Congress, sometimes the ministries can't say what is the participation of women in that specific program. So sometimes there is discrepancy between the values because the information is given before the draft bill is approved. Thank you, Elaine, for the clarifications. We're here today with civil society, with control agencies. Our purpose is not to leave this meeting, and our initiative involves civil society and other players. But the idea here is not to leave the meeting with reports or with demands for the government. We see the difficulties and we want to understand them. I understand the difficulties, and the fluctuation in these values is related to the fact that we don't have a stable methodology, and the definition of a stable methodology is important. That's why I talked to Dulce. Dulce, your participation is important. She worked in the Treasury Department. She has a lot of experience, and SIAFI is very important to us. It gives us a lot of information, reliable information. And today, people have public access to SIAFI. People have access to this information directly. But in order for this system to work, there are some premises. And to change such a robust system as SIAFI, it's not easy. I have been dreaming about this for 2 decades. I propose changes, but Treasury says, no, you can't do that yet because we have to increase the number of fields so that you can increase the categories. So if you increase 2 digits in numbers, you have to review the database, you have to see how you will store the information. And obviously the priority is the revenue service and not SIAFI. So this clarification is important because the government didn't publish this data like that because they wanted to, because they wanted to deceive society, parliament. No, we know that problems exist. It's something new, as Rita said, and SEAP was conceived in 1987. We had the classification of the expenditure. It was defined in a decree of 2001. And from then on, we didn't have major updates. We didn't have changes in the classification of revenues and expenditures. Recently, in 2021, we had more details about the sources. It was a large challenge to implement this in all of the municipalities. The municipalities had to use the same codes for sources. It's not something easy to do. Elaine, your intervention was great because one of the reasons for this event is to clarify these doubts. The auditors, the prosecutors, civil society, consultants, professionals who work with the budget, they have a clearer perspective of how it works. But consultants who work in the legislative branch, this step has to be built together. Everybody has to understand what's happening. And we need to do something similar to that was done for the sources. The public prosecutor's office had an important role in this area. It was an action that was recognized by civil society. They were able to standardize the sources. Prosecutor Claudio and Prosecutor Silvia made recommendations to the Ministry of Economy, to the Treasury, and they enacted a decree to standardize the sources. Having said that, I called Prosecutor Samantha. She participated in these activities. She's always a great partner of ours, and she also represents Prosecutor Raquel Branquinho, General Director of the School of the Prosecutor's Office, and she's also a coordinator of the working group to prevent and fight against political and gender violence. I now pass the floor to Prosecutor Samantha. Good afternoon. Thank you, Luciene. I just like to correct you that the coordinator is Prosecutor Raquel, not me. I'm not coordinator of the working group. But the way you said it, people might understand that I'm the coordinator. I'm actually the spokesperson. I'd like to thank you for this event. And the prosecutor has a lot of experience on this topic. That's why she supported Luciene's idea to hold this workshop. I'll ask questions to 3 of the speakers, but I'd like to make some general observations first. Based on what Dulce said, first, the budget is one of the main parts and the main parts behind democracy. It's the law of democracy. The role of parliament is to vote the budget so that the executive branch can act. But the budget there's this idea behind the budget. It's closely connected to democracy, social participation, and government, and the power limited by the rule of law, and limited especially in its expenditures, in the way it which collects resources and spends them. We all know that oppression can happen through excessive expenditures, but also lack of expenditures as well. In this sense, it's very relevant to consider good quality public expenditures, and they have to be controlled. And this is something that we don't have optimally in the country yet. We have improved this process in the last decades, obviously, starting from our constitution. Now we have more instruments to control the budget. Luciene said that the event is organized by civil society, but with the Superior School from the prosecutor's office. And the prosecutor's office is one of the institutional leaders for civil society. This is one of the innovations in our constitution. It gives the voice to society. That's the role of the prosecutor's office. It's to protect the most vulnerable segments of the population. It also monitors the enforcement of the law, but it has to protect those who are vulnerable and protect civil society.
The way in which we control expenditure goes through the correct action as declared by the control agencies. I know the Court of Accounts is an example in its own technical actions in the federal area. That is very important, but I think so that the control and that we can discuss the controllability of the expenditures, the budgeting, and also with the budget in the necessary expenditures based on the so-called civil society, is that without any offense, I mean, the Brazilian budget is opaque to citizens, if you will. It's blurred to the citizens. It doesn't belong to the Secretary of Treasury, it doesn't belong to the Parliament, but even to those who act in the legal area, it has a degree of blurriness, if you will. It's hard to translate technical terms into an accessible language. So this will be difficult to be built for the whole citizenship to understand whatever it says. So our attempt, what we're looking for always, is to keep going forward, to have better human resources, better material resources. We wanted to make it possible for citizens to have access to the budget in the many little boxes as divided in other figures. And at the same time, this is a way of seeing things more generally. So I think this is such an analytical analysis, if I may. It's for the technicians, but for regular citizens, they need to understand how much they spent on healthcare in their region, their municipality, and so on. We are still far away from this reality, be it because of the level of instruction in the country, and even those who don't have a higher level, they don't understand that with a lot of ease, but because we're lacking this culture on the viewpoint, which is less ideological, less connected to what we can do. So we need to get away from these traps. And the society also needs to be more aware of that in terms of participation. So I want to ask Rita and Elaine. In relation to the execution of the budget, which is the control of the budget, be it gender budget or not, I think in order to have more buy-in, the point is to reduce inequalities, be them gender or other nature, through the allocation of resources in the budget for public policies, so that through the general policies, and because women, as the majority of the population, have to be also included in health and education. All of this has to reach them proportionately. The women have to get it. We cannot, on behalf of a gender budget, forget that as an overall piece, which the budget is, needs to demand to meet the demands of the overall needs, other than the specificities of those who are conducted to reduce inequalities, to improve social inequalities, and with that, the state will better deliver. So then I agree with Dulce. Maybe the discourse has to go through the reduction of inequalities, including gender inequalities. And now the allocation will be able to identify gender needs, and they will have a positive outcome in the society as a whole. But other than that, the problems in the Brazilian budget, I think the gender issue goes through that, and I think it can be harmed in a way in terms of being too general, which has to do with the execution of what we call the parliament amendments, the parliament funds. We have the multi-year plan and the execution of these plans as they are being done, with the lack of conditions to monitor and follow up. The Court of Accounts and the state courts of accounts have to look for this money application. It has been approved by the experience in Maranhão, how this affects the balance in the multi-year plan, because this affects women, and it affects more women. If we think about primary actions, those are the mothers who are taking their children. Women are more prone to certain basic diseases and so on, and even biological issues. Even so, because they stay more at home, they don't have enough sanitation. So there is a negative, a situation which is to do with budgeting, given this category of the amendments. Would like to hear. May I just make all my comments and then they answer? No, I thought you were finished. Please go ahead. For Scherie, because Anna has left, unfortunately, but talking about the norm, the standard discourse for the reduction of the inequalities through a gender budget, taking into account the factors which make the gap bigger. Scherie, you mentioned very well the economic aspect, and I remember the sentence, which is now a meme, but it says the economic issue, in the end of the day, entails acceptance or understanding, not just because the polarization of the debate, but because it is not very well seen. This is not a prerogative of Brazil only, but within this work of this idea for gender budgeting, as you mentioned, for like 40 years, 4 decades, if we work the idea of reducing inequalities and reducing the autonomy of a person, be it a woman or a man, is it possible today to go on into other factors other than work, labor? So if we do break down the gap, then this is a hurdle and a difficult task to be obtained, because when you mention the non or unpaid care work of women for taking care of children, usually taking care of the elderly, If this was a male's world, then this would be official formal market. We are sure of that. When this is a source of income to women, this will increase the return to the society. And this is work that is a factor that really thrusts this improvement. And if we have to make choices of allocation in the budget to make a possibility and for the opportunities of work, so that there is an increase in the autonomy, and this creates a cultural change in the end of the day. This is the pathway so that the society, which is behind it, can then see an injustice a long time, or as many will say, it used to be a time when males were the providers and women would not run the risk of not being out and about in the street or working outside. And evidently the most privileged one may be less, but there's such an issue of the discussion of the social part. So we must advance to try and change culturally, socially. So if you can say a few things about that, Scherie. And lately, the last one for Kelly, how were you able to approve a law in the state of Acre, the gender budgeting? Because it is a sensitive thing. It's not as easy to take on. There should be more rationality. And it's not what we see in the major topics, in the most relevant topics. So some of the results are very sad. Or we end up having a lack of mobility. So it's a topic that we want to speak a lot, and the Congress cannot go beyond. And the judiciary has to come and sort this through. So we can have legal dispute. So I want to ask, what was the development of the debate for you to actually have this possibilities of approving this as a law? I thank you for the opportunity. I am in love with everything I heard, with all the speeches. It is a topic that I want to delve into very much. And if possible, I want to be able to contribute with a lot more whenever there's an opportunity, and for at least to understand better. So I think we have to look for a different type of discourse to avoid misunderstandings so that people are not prejudiced about it. We ourselves have to study that. So I thank you very much. I thank you all who have come here, who have participated remotely. Thank you very much. Scherie, I think we need to organize a second round of the seminar to be able to delve into what Dulce and Samantha said. These topics are too deep. Yes, I am here holding myself, but I wanted to propose something in the end to be something collective, so we don't take time from anyone. I would like to hand over to Elaine. Elaine will answer about the amendments, to talk about the issues. And if Rita, we know that 1/4 of discretionary expenditures are within the parliament expenses, and public policies do depend on these amendments. So then Scherie, and finally Kelly, okay? Elaine? Yes. So to make it very clear, Samantha, I'm fully in agreement with you. The Brazilian budget is still a very difficult to understand, very complex, hermetic piece. We have been working in the Ministry of Planning for a few years now in an attempt to make this budget more comprehensive to the citizens at large. And the report is part of this process of making this more transparent. But going towards amendments in the parliament, I think it is well known to everyone that we live this moment of transition between the executive and the legislature. Rita mentioned that the constitution is a parliamentarist constitution as pertaining the budget. And along the years, we did see an increase in the prerogative of the legislative branch on top of the budget. These changes are changes which we in the executive branch are learning to work with. So I think this is the first data of reality. We're still in a scenario that is changing every day, but quickly, and that we are learning to position ourselves in this new context. And then, in relation to the amendment, Samantha, we have a huge challenge, which is one that we're getting away from a small amount of amendments to quite an expressive amount of amendments, especially when we consider the discretionary part of the budget, which is what we have when we translate into general language, which is this part that a governor will then decide the allocation and the way they will spend. Most of the budget, as Luciane mentioned, in Brazil is mandatory. It is all established in a legislation that can be done by budgetary resources. And we have a small part which we call discretionary, that the authority may decide how they'll spend. And along the years, there's a dispute between the legislature and the executive branch on how to spend this discretionary expenditure. So at this point in time, we have quite an expressive participation of the executive branch in this discretionary part. And the challenge is for us to qualify the amendments and drive them into what we understood to be the priorities of the country. So when I spoke about innovation in 2024, which was sending the summary and the statement on what would be the programs associated to each one of the cross-cutting agendas, this is what we meant. It is an attempt for you to drive, to channel the amendments for the programs that we believe to be priority. In what you're mentioning, Samantha, which is to reduce inequality. So all cross-cutting agendas have as a principle the reduction or the closing of inequalities. My last sentence, Luciane, would be that I believe that the gender issue is sustained regardless of the perspective that you adopt. So if we are to talk in a language which is purely economic, we might use the following argument, which is irrational on the viewpoint of the economy, that you have the most schooled portion of the Brazilian population at the margin of the labor market, because the Brazilian female participation in the labor markets is smaller than the male participation. So in other words, it means that the Brazilian state invested in that citizen for them to go to school, and then after, when they become adults, they put that citizen aside. They cannot contribute with the knowledge that they have acquired. Legally speaking, we can defend that the federal constitution establishes that we're all equal, but reality shows that only a few citizens can really exercise their rights. So all statistics of the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics puts the situation of women in this aspect of inequality. So regardless of the perspective that we adopt, gender is always permeating. Thank you very much. Rita, do you want to say anything real quick? Because our time is short. I just have a few things to provoke. Maybe should discuss later. We need to talk about parliament amendments, but remember, public expenditure was very nice. It's very beautiful. And the parliament amendments came and messed it up. Is that right? No. The minister today is a former congressman, and one learns from the other. So we need to look at the system, the governance system that we have installed with the incentives that have been put, and to talk about this relationship to it Elaine is mentioning. Yeah, I think we need to have like a seminar on that, on the impact of parliament amendments on the gender budget, because this is a dimension that is extremely important. But I would like to hand over to Scherie that she can say her comments about the provocation given by the general sub-prosecutor Samantha made, please.
Thank you very much. I'd be very interested in that seminar on parliamentary amendments. It's something I think is very interesting in Brazil. So I really enjoyed Samantha's intervention. I think that she hit the nail on the head about how central cultural change is to everything in terms of moving the needle on these key gender inequalities. And the thing is that unpaid care is something that is not addressed through one policy action, but actually through a multitude of policy actions. And I think it really highlights the interconnectedness of different gender inequalities, because in order to move the needle and to really make change in this space, you have to look at a range of policy areas, be it, for example, parental leave. I think, where you've got unequal parental leave, that's where these unequal care responsibilities start from the beginning, and where those habits then carry on throughout the life cycle. And you also need to look at women in leadership, whether it's in parliament, in government, women in media, women in education. We have to promote the role of women in society as being different from what it is now. Or whether it's, for example, efforts to close the pay gap, which would ultimately change the decision making in households about who has the care responsibilities. And so, yeah, there's a number of policy areas, I think, where it's important to make progress in order for that cultural change to actually happen. I think central to it are also valuing the care economy differently, and also raising awareness about the unpaid care responsibilities that women take. And I think we are seeing increased awareness about that. I'm thinking about a EU survey that happens on unpaid care responsibilities. I remember recently looking at the findings and seeing that the number of hours that women and men spend cleaning has gone down, which raised questions to me about just everybody doing less cleaning these days. Maybe that should be the new goal. But speaking of goals, I think that also central to this is Brazil having some clear goals in this space, right? And an interconnected set of policy priorities in the space of gender equality that will put at its core, achieving cultural change to close gender gaps. Anyway, thank you very much.
Muitíssimo obrigada, Scherie.
Thank you very much, Scherie. I now pass the floor to Kelly so that she can respond to the comments from Dr. Samantha. So please be very brief, because we have to wrap up. It's a good topic. We want to spend hours here in debate. Dr. Samantha, thank you very much for your interventions. All of your interventions were very pertinent, and it makes us think how much we have to evolve, discuss, learn a lot more, share a lot more. In our case, how were we able to approve this law with such a sensitive topic? I can tell you that our harsh reality in terms of violence indicators and equality indicators, that's what pushed us to approve the law. And we also transferred this commitment from us to the parliament. The parliament became a partner. They're also a part of the problem. They need to help us to solve the problem. And it was approved unanimously. Nobody challenged the decision. And this is also based on the experience that we had with the children and adolescents budget. In the second year of implementation, the Legislative Assembly didn't participate in the committee. They asked to participate in this committee because they wanted to be a part of the planning process, the monitoring process. And with these successful results, when we presented the gender budgeting proposal, it was approved unanimously, but we need to raise awareness and we need to make them aware that they're also responsible. It's not only the responsibility of the executive branch, the legislative branch has a role as well. Thank you, Kelly. I want to make a final comment, and I will use the observations from somebody from the audience. He said something here in the chat. He said, it was a very rich debate. And I think we need to have a new agenda. The new agenda is important. September is a good month because it's a month in which we can celebrate a year of the law that was approved in the state of Acre. It's an initiative from one of our guests, but also because there are some points that we need to reflect on a bit more. And I'll share the comment from Gustavo Henrique da Costa. He said the following. During the presentation, somebody mentioned that it's not about creating a different budget for women. Based on what Elaine said, I agree with her. It would be necessary to create a program to better monitor expenditures and revenues. That's his observation from Gustavo. He participated online. I want to go back to what Gloria said. I'm not sure if how this can help us in the communication, or it might make things more difficult as well, because in the international level, we have a gender sensitive budget. It doesn't mean that the budget is meant only for men or only for women. What I understand from this expression, it's that it's a budget with markers, with indicators, and it seems that Ecuador is evolving, has evolved a lot, and in order to implement SIAFI in Brazil, SIAFI has to be studied. I'm not saying that it's a barrier. I think we have to call the Treasury to this conversation. But based on what I understood, I think we have to sit down together with the Treasury and talk about how can we have markers, indicators. How much of the budget focused on gender is a part of the political fight? Because budget is a political fight for allocation of resources. And the communication is a bit complicated in Brazil because of our experience of having a binding budget. It's an imposing budget, a tied up budget, and this generates resistance in Brazil. If I'm mistaken, please correct me if I'm wrong. But this is a topic that we have to face. A gender-sensitive budget is a methodology so that the society, parliament, specialized agencies that evaluate the public policy so that they can have a common element to work with. And the unit that takes care of the budget in the Court of Accounts checks if the budget is a means to deliver results to the evaluators in the ministries, the evaluators in the specialized units of the Court of Accounts. They run audits on public policies. Do they have mechanisms to break down the budget and identify any type of public policy and how this public policy is benefiting a certain gender? I'm not talking about transgender women, men. Which gender is receiving how much? Why is it that this public policy allocated more money to this gender and not to this other one? It's not yet clear to me what is the strategy that Brazil has been adopting. Not from the Acre perspective. I would need to understand it better. We need more debates. And also from the perspective of Brazil, I don't fully understand it either. If we identify the gender, if we have identifiers for that, the political fight to allocate resources to each gender, are these resources being more allocated to gender X, gender Y? This is the debate that we have been having, but it's a qualified debate. I think we have had efforts. The efforts are important. The first steps are important. But I can't say today, I can't say if the federal budget is being more allocated to gender A, B, or C. I can't say. I don't know. So this is my perception, and I pass the floor to all of you for your final remarks. You don't have to answer my questions. This is just doubts that I have, and this is food for thought for our next event. We can schedule it together. Thank you very much to all of you, and I'll start from the beginning. I'll pass the floor to Elaine, and then we'll have a full round of final remarks from all of you. Elaine, you go first. First, I'd like to thank AuditCU for this event, for holding this event, for inviting us to participate today. As you noticed, it's a very rich topic, complex topic, and it would be too bold of us to try to cover all bases today in a few hours. I hope to contribute in a next round of debates. I'd like to be able to clarify doubts. I think we were able to solve some of the initial doubts, and once we delve deeper into the discussion, new doubts arise. It's natural, it's part of the learning process. But I'd like to say that it was a great surprise to have the auditors from the Court of Accounts discussing the gender-sensitive budget. And as Rita said in her presentation, it's a path that we will only tread together. We're a part, all of us are a part of this. We have to understand what are the possible ways forward so that we actually move forward. So these are my final remarks. Thank you. Thank you, Elaine, for your participation as a representative of the Secretariat of Federal Budget. You're a key stakeholder in this process. I know you for a long time. I know the experts from the Secretariat of the Federal Budget. I have great respect for you, and we're very glad to have had you here talking about such a relevant topic. I now pass the floor to Scherie. so that she can make her final remarks.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to take much of your time. Just to say, first of all, that this is a wonderful opportunity for Brazil right now. You've got such great political momentum behind gender inequality. And so I'm really glad that institutions with great credibility like the TCU are taking this topic seriously and helping advance the topic from their part. I know that it's very important that all of the institutions of government try and advance in this area. No one can do it alone. And so that stands for, you know, the audit institution, the legislature, the government. Everybody needs to work together and challenge each other to do better. There's no better time than now in Brazil. So seize the moment.
Muitíssimo obrigada,
Thank
Scherie.
you, Scherie. Thank you for your participation, for accepting this invitation to participate in this event. It's held by Audi TCU. It's an association of the auditors of the Court of Accounts in Brazil in partnership with Women in Budget, Elas no Orçamento, and also with the Prosecutor's Office as well. And here we have an under prosecutor that has an important role in budget matters as well. It was an honor to have you with us, to have the opportunity of having this debate and this dialogue with the OECD, and we hope to have your participation in future events as well, with civil society and with other institutions as well. I'd like to note the participation in the chat of the Directorate of Oversight on Human Rights. They take care of the policy for human rights. Patricia Yuri participated through the chat. I now pass the floor to Rita, who inspired me to organize this event. We idealized this event last year, and it's great to see that it became a reality. Thank you, Luciene. I'm very happy to see the results of our discussion of the day. And this calls for new discussions. And I think our challenge is to follow the example of Elaine. Example from Kelly that was able to help approve a law in this area. And if we want to reap the fruits, we need to sow the seeds. We need to build what isn't there yet. And we have new levels to discuss. When we ask ourselves about SEAFI, SEAFI doesn't include the attributes so that we can actually map public policies for women. Who defines the attributes in SEAFI? Who is making the decisions about governance? We need more women to bring this to the forefront of the discussions. There's no opposition against policies for women. There's a low recognition of these matters. And this is the reason for the veto of the provision of our guidelines, budget guidelines law. A provision was vetoed, including reports about women's budget. It was vetoed. And we have a cultural challenge because of the bureaucracy of the state. We have trouble tackling this issue without public governance, without public finances being more qualified. So if we don't have that, we won't be able to advance in our budget. It depends on a broader system, but I'm very happy to be here and I hope we have other opportunities to meet. And thank you, Scherie. I think you are in a different time zone. You have your baby with you. I know it was challenging for you to participate because of the differences in time, but we're all working together. And sometimes We have to sacrifice some personal issues to participate in these events. But thank you very much, Scherie, for being here with us today. Thank you, Rita, for your words. And I'll pass the floor to Kelly so that she can make her final remarks. Luciene, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'd like to thank Audi TCU and all other institutions that are a part of this event. As a last remark, I'd like to say that establishing markers in the budget is still a challenge for us, and we need to learn a lot every day in order to evolve. But concerning gender-sensitive budgeting, I think that transparency in our actions, not only with numbers, with closed figures, but the transparency of the actions themselves and the results of these public policies will speak for themselves. The numbers will speak for themselves. And we will be able to break resistances, and we will be able to expand these markers in the budget. At some point, we'll be able to identify all of the details, all of the resources that have been allocated. The state of Acre is very grateful to participate, and we accept the challenge of presenting in our next debate in September. We will present the methodology that was created to evaluate the gender-sensitive budget in the state of Acre. Excellent, we have a commitment, and we want to know more about the dissertation, the master thesis that is being proposed by Dennis. We'll bring it to show as well, to share with you. I pass the floor to Dr. Aline for her final remarks as well. Go ahead. I'd like to say that I learned a lot today. It was a singular opportunity, and I was here as a debater, but actually I'm here as a student. I learned a lot from all of the speakers. They brought a lot of information, a lot of data that will help us change and several of our measures. Isabelle's thesis and Isabelle's final work will have a different meaning based on the inputs that she heard here today. So I'd like to thank you very much. And I think that not only have the seeds germinated, but we have basically a tree with several fruits. I'd like to thank the Higher School of the Prosecutor's Office, Audi TCU, Elas no Orçamento, for organizing this international seminar with such wonderful women. Thank you very much. Thank you, Aline. We thank you, Unigran Rio, the university that you're representing. It was very important to have this engagement from the students and professors from Unigran Rio, and also the University of Brasilia and the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Dulce, my colleague, is the next to speak. You can make your final comments. Dulce is representing the Court of Accounts, the unit that specializes on the budget. We assess and the accounts and the programs and the accounts of the President of the Republic, and the budget dimension is very important, definitely. I'd just like to thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for giving me this opportunity of learning more about the topic. Thank you, Dulce. And I'll pass the floor to Samantha, Dr. Samantha, under Prosecutor General of the Republic. She's representing the Superior School of the Prosecutor's Office. Without the school, this event would not happen. It's very important to have this partnership with the Prosecutor's Office. Thank you for the participation of the students And the students will be able to use these hours in the workshop as extra credits. And for undergraduate studies, this is very important. This reflects on their work, and this event means even more. So the school had a very important role in our event today. Samantha, your final remarks, please. Thank you, Luciane. I'd just like to thank you for this opportunity of hearing experts, high-level experts. It was a concrete debate, and I'm very happy to have been able to learn from you, to talk to you about this topic. And I'm leaving with several doubts, which means that the debate was excellent. Our purpose with this event was to show you how the auditors, prosecutors, consultants, managers, how the academia, how we can have better means, better methods to monitor and assess public policies. Monitoring and assessment were included in our Constitution with Constitutional Amendment 109 of 2021. So it's now an obligation. Our agencies have the obligation of setting up a structure to monitor and assess public policies. We know that this work is quite complex. It requires reliable data, comparable data. And what made us focus on this topic is that we believe a qualitative budget with qualitative information, qualitative markers for gender, and futurely it can evolve to other areas. But this type of budget can improve the work of experts in public policies, scholars who work with assessments. They need databases, comparable and trustworthy databases. We believe that the budget is a means to an end so that we can reach this level, so that the citizens can understand budget information in all levels of government. It's a long path ahead of us. It's a path. In order to have data about what was executed, this involves an important stakeholder, which is the Treasury. In the next event, we have to invite the Treasury Department along with the Secretariat for the federal budget so that we could better understand and so that we can take the next step. But what we did from 1960 until today, we did a lot. In 1980, actually, we evolved a lot. In Brazil, the initiatives starting in the year 2000 are praiseworthy initiatives. The last initiatives starting in 2020 gave a significant leap, and I leave you with a provocation. If the name of the report, Women's Budget, does this name help, or maybe can it be misunderstood? That's my provocation to you, so that we can take another step and so that we can bring all the genders to the discussion and so that they can all embrace the same cause. And with this, I'd like to say goodbye to all of you. I'd like to thank once again all of the entities and institutions that supported this event and the ones that promoted this event along with us, Elas no Orçamento and the Superior School of the Prosecutor's Office. And with that, I'd like to conclude our event. Good evening to you all. Until next time, thank you.